Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about album number 3 from Tangerine Dream, Zeit. Alright, out of all the pre-Phage era releases from this band, this is the one that tends to get the most attention. Also, out of those first 4, it was the first I actually listened to. I heard this one, I think, in college. I didn't get around to the other 3 until much later. And certainly this will mark a very important point in their history. First of all, this was the first Tangerine Dream album to feature the band's most well-known lineup, now a trio of Edgar Froese, Christopher Franke, and now Peter Baumann, which would remain until the mid-later 70s. The album also briefly features the former keyboardist from the last album, Steve Schroeder, making his last appearance, as well as a guest appearance from Popol Vuh founder Florian Fricke. But this album is also important for completing their transition from experimental rock into straightforward ambient and electronic styles they're properly known for pioneering. The title track on their last album, Alpha Centauri, really hinted towards a much more languid and open, cosmic soundscape kind of style, but this album really shows them doubling down on that particular side to their sound, ditching any of the remaining rock influences from previous records, and delivering some much more experimentally inclined drone pieces, which really set their sound apart from the crowd at the time. In a lot of ways, you could consider Zeit to be one of the first proper ambient records ever, possibly the first dark ambient record. Back in 1972, there really wasn't anything else out there quite like it to compare it to, aside from maybe a few of their contemporaries on the same scene. And it's still well remembered to this day. I mean, Steven Wilson has previously gone on record saying that this is his #1 favorite album of all time in any genre. Granted, as massively historically important as this album is, it's also one that can be rather divisive among certain sects of the fan base, and not one that's going to exactly please everyone equally because, well, I mean, if you thought their first 2 albums were a bit of a difficult listen, they kinda pale in comparison to the scale of this one. Again, this is a straight ambient drone record. There's no drums, there's no pulse, very little in the way of melody, and going out of its way to create a very foreboding and dark atmosphere. And it's also a double album stretching on for over 70 minutes, comprised of 4 compositions, all averaging about 18 minutes in length, each taking up a full side of vinyl. This is not a listen for the faint of heart. But it also kinda runs together as well. It's extremely easy to listen to the whole project and get completely lost in it, for better or for worse. For some people, listening to this album in full may as well equate to over an hour of completely empty sensory deprivation. That's obviously not to say nothing happens over the course of that running time, far from it. There's plenty of subtle evolutions and interesting low-key textures running through the entire project, but it's easy to be fooled into thinking nothing's happening from how ridiculously slow everything moves. The album's even subtitled Largo in 4 movements. This is an album that demands a lot out of the listener and isn't going to easily reward most of them. Even I can't say that I absolutely love the album myself, just because it's so difficult for me to give my full attention to all the way through. The slowness and sameness of the album has often resulted in my attention trailing off for much of it. It requires such a specific mood and setting to most effectively get into. But at the same time, even on my first listen of this thing years ago, I could tell how impressive it actually was, and I did find the spacey, edge of a black hole type atmosphere to be really immersive and intriguing. I got the hype for it pretty immediately. The first movement, Birth of Liquid Plejades. Plejades? I always thought this was pretty dang cool right off the bat. This cut is kind of split into 3 near seamlessly blended together subsections. The first 6 or 7 minutes or so are entirely delivered by intense and dissonant pads of cello, care of guest performances from the Cologne Cello Quartet. The strings just slowly melting over each other in a slightly chaotic but hypnotizing blur. Very intense and dramatic stuff, but eventually fading into some more synth-heavy arrangements that have a much more minimalistic approach to their sound, again primarily focusing on monolithic and lonely keyboard drones, but some of the synth lines on top periodically wobble in a way that vaguely reminds me of like Indian or Middle Eastern music or something, and there might be some pads that vaguely resemble an operatic soloist in the background. And eventually, the last 4 minutes of the piece return to some of the monolithic organ sounds of the type you might hear on their previous album, but with a lot more filtering to add to that spacey and cosmic effect. It's a near 20-minute journey that feels huge, that evokes the infinite emptiness of space, but also conveys this very subtle sense of movement throughout, and never feels like it's growing stale or stagnating, as if you're traveling through space at light speed but can't intuit how fast you're actually moving, because everything in space is so far away that it takes years for light to come from one star and reach another. It's a feeling that all the other pieces on this album evoke just as well, but perhaps in some different ways. Nebulous Dawn is a much darker, more abstract, and less melodic piece than even the opener. This is some real dark ambient. The closest you get to melody in a piece like this would be like a filtered bass drone that fades in and out at regular intervals, and some formless blends of vibraphones in the early moments of the track. But soon the bass becomes a lot more neutral and dissonant in tone. You get waves of shuffling synth textures that vaguely resemble percussion, or other kind of screeching bell-like effects elsewhere, acting in the place of a melodic motif. Other kind of squelching effects in other parts, and the whole last section where the bass drone entirely changes key a minor third downwards from where it was before. Everything may seem to come together in a formless cloud without much definition, but there's always quite a bit going on at any given moment, and once again there's a steady, if difficult to pin down, sense of movement to the whole thing. Now, I can easily mark these first two cuts as great, making full use of their dark ambient sound in very different ways. Although when it comes to the second half of the project, my attention does fairly consistently start to trail off a bit as it starts to feel like we cycle through some of the same ideas that the first half set down in a more interesting way. Origin of Supernatural Possibilities, to its credit, does possibly have slightly more of a sense of progression than even the previous two tracks did, most notably with the way it bookends itself with some very low-key and tranquil minor-key guitar ambience that almost feels comforting in comparison with the rest of the album. Though the piece in between feels like it's splitting the difference between the sounds of the first two cuts. Still really cool stuff. The mix of wailing synth pads, filtered wobbling bass that rapidly pans itself back and forth between both ears, some of those bleeping electronic effects that sound like they're trying to evoke shooting stars, and some more monolithic bass drones that come and go, and a whole section near the end which returns to a comparatively more meditative space full of more austere synth drones that sort of imitate strings, but not really, and others that sort of imitate operatic soloists again. It's neat for sure, executes all those sounds in as effectively immersive a manner as before with plenty of dark ambient texture to go around, and it helps add to the monolithic effect the entire album is going for, but a lot of it can feel like deja vu, and if you're listening to the whole album in one sitting, it's surprisingly easy to miss when this track begins and ends. And that finally takes us to the fourth movement in the title track, the single emptiest and ghostliest track out of all four, and as much as I hate to say it, also the one that interested me the least. Not to say there isn't plenty of value to be gleaned out of the markedly spookier approach to this track's sound, with all these wavering pads that sound like anguished wails, or windy ambience that evokes a lot more negative space than any of the previous three cuts had, sections that have bassy, string-like drones that almost seem to resemble like passing airplanes or something, or some other squelchier effects in between. The whole track does kind of give off a similar effect to the middle section of Pink Floyd's Echoes, but stretched out even further and made even more monolithic and spacious. But even if that markedly colder and emptier feel of this closer allows it to stand apart from the other three a bit better, it's also the one that I have easily the hardest time giving my full attention, and the one that feels like it has the least dimensionality. Thematically appropriate as a finish, but not quite as strong a way to go out as the way we started. But that's everything on Zeit. I mean, I may have my issues and personal hang-ups with it, but this feels like their first complete and fully realized statement as a band, and their first proper classic album. They really nailed something special down here that would go on to influence many generations of ambient artists to come, providing a sort of blueprint for the genre that is still copied off of, and built upon to this day. I suppose your mileage may slightly vary on how well it holds up as a standalone work, removed from the historical context of being released in 1972 before this genre really got off the ground. Again, for me, it's always been an album that requires me to be in a really specific mood, and I might feel like it loses steam in its second half. It's an album I personally only really like and don't quite love. And obviously it's one of their least easily approachable or immediate releases. I can totally understand anyone who might find the undertaking of listening to it too intimidating, with not enough reward for them at the end. It's probably not an album I would recommend as like a starting point to get into them. but it is the first album in their catalog that I would consider properly essential for any fans of the band. It's a fan favorite for very good reason, and there still aren't many albums that are able to evoke the vast emptiness of space and how insignificant we really are in the grander scheme of the universe in as effective and engaging a way as this album did. So, I think all that leaves me feeling a strong 7.7 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.